Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Santa Clara County Finance and Government Operations Committee. First item of business is to ask the clerk to call the roll and establish the presence of a quorum as we call the meeting to order.
Supervisor Chavez.
Here.
Supervisor Siminian.
Here.
We have a quorum.
We have a quorum. Thank you very much. That takes us to item number 2, which is public comment. Public comment is that portion of our agenda set aside for comment by members of the public on non-agendized items properly within the jurisdiction of this committee. We allow up to 3 minutes for speakers under public comment, unless there is a exceptionally long list. And today, it looks like we have just one speaker under public comment. And we will ask Scott Largent to come forward. Mr. Largent, as I mentioned, you have 3 minutes, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Christmas again today. I had another visit about half an hour ago, so I got 2.5 hours with my daughter. This is visit number 5 now. It gets a little sad at the end now because she doesn't want me to leave. She starts to really pout, and so we're going to get back into court so we don't have to do these $200 visits. So they get kind of expensive. I've been preparing, as you guys know, for the contempt charge that I'm going to have to go up against our presiding judge, pretty much, Patricia Lucas. So I've been getting everything in order. I met with my attorney 2 days ago to kind of lay down the ground rules and make sure that he's willing to want to go after the establishment like this, because I'm going to do it the same way that I did the Bullhorn trial. I subpoenaed everybody from the top brass of the San Jose Police Department for that one. They used their cell phones to communicate with each other to machinate to throw me in jail. Okay, now I get along with all these guys over there, but it was wrong to do this 1.5 years ago. And when I subpoenaed them all the day after coffee with a cop to kind of send that message, they ended up quashing all the subpoenas. They wouldn't allow them to testify. So they kind of Chief Garcia was my accuser, so was Deputy Chief Knopf and Chief No, that's now with the Sunnyvale Police Department. With this new one coming up, Patricia Lucas is the one that was screaming and yelling on the other line, telling the deputies to arrest me, okay? The accuser that day and the people that kept reporting me, saying that I was harassing attorneys, turns out it's my ex's new attorney. So, I mean, this is really getting, the drama is just lifting up on this one. So I'm preparing for this. There is no reason that I should not be able to address my accusers in a jury trial. That's how I thought this whole thing worked out. I'm just very upset with this stuff. It needs to get fixed. This is not okay. It was not okay what happened to me in front of the San Jose Police Department. I wasn't really bothering anybody, not blocking a sidewalk. A couple days before Christmas. This is another thing. I was using a kid's toy, a little yellow megaphone. Now, bear in mind, it's not Scott's Voice of God bullhorn that he bought on Craigslist, the really loud one. We're talking a plastic kid's toy that my grandmother gave me. She said, Scott, you need to take this one down here. I don't want you getting in trouble. Sure enough, Grandma was really mad about that one. So, you know, it's ridiculous. I was not blocking a sidewalk, guys. I mean, that's what I hope people are starting to realize is I was not blocking it. I was out on the city sidewalk, not on their property. And now everybody else has been pushed across the street. So this is going to be very exciting. They won't drop the charges. You got to realize that. They want to get stay-away orders. And it's our legal community. It's the judges and the crooked lawyers that are causing all these problems. All my anger directed towards the Sheriff's Department, there was a couple of issues. But I'm starting to realize what the judges were doing. They were the ones ordering the deputies to come to my home. They're the ones that were ordering them to arrest me. If you watch the video online, those guys didn't want to arrest me. But when they have Patricia Lucas screaming in their ear, that's, you know, what are they going to do? Those are orders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to confirm with the clerk that we have no other speakers under public comment. We do have one speaker, Marvin Jin, who's got a card in on item number 7, which is a possible consent calendar item. So before we take action on that one, Supervisor Chavez, I will provide an opportunity for a member of the public to speak, depending a little bit on how we structure our agenda today. For those of you who are not regulars here, let me just indicate, having completed public comment, we go now to item number 3, which is to approve the consent calendar and changes to the committee's agenda. And Supervisor Chavez, what I'd like to recommend, and again, obviously if there's any item you'd like to keep on the regular agenda rather than move to consent, we will hear that item today. But in the interest of providing ample time for important items that require discussion as opposed to your important item, which may already be well resolved and which does not require discussion. What I want to suggest is this, that we take items 5 and 6 regarding technology use policies and do those next. And I believe that, I don't know how much interest or engagement you have in mind, but I think I can handle all of that in 10 minutes or less, believe it or not. So, and Supervisor Chavez indicates she's going to be watching the clock on me. Then move to item number 4, which is the draft affordable housing impact mitigation fee. And just to gauge what we've got here, I do have cards from Jessica Von Bork, David Demarest, Jean Snyder, and Catherine Palter, I believe all of whom are from the university. Do we have any other speakers here today who are going to want to speak on that item? If we could just gauge that now. All right, then Supervisor Chavez, while our rule is usually 2 minutes apiece, I'm going to suggest 3 minutes just so that we have a little more opportunity for folks to weigh in and share their point of view today when the time comes on that specific item. So then, as I say, we'll do items 5 and 6 first, if that's agreeable. We would then go to items 4, item 4, which is the Stanford University matter. And then what I want to suggest is that items 7, 8, 11, and 12 be acted upon in our consent calendar if you're amenable to that, while deferring items 9 and 10. Okay? And I'm going to want to defer items 6 as well, but I'll come back to that. So again, I'm going to ask Supervisor Chavez for a motion to take up items 5 and 6 first, then go to item 4, and to put items 7, 8, 11, and 12 on our consent calendar, and to defer action till August on items 9 and 10. Supervisor, are you amenable to that?
Yes, what I would like to do is after the public speaker on the consent item that you raised, I do have 2 comments that I would like to make, one on 7 and one on 8.
Great. Then why don't we ask Mr. Marvin Jin to come forward? And if you want to come up to the center aisle podium here, and again, for those of you who haven't used this podium before, there is a microphone embedded even though it is not readily apparent. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martin Jin. I'm the chief steward over at Health and Hospital System. Been with the county for 16 years. Worked in the IT department over at the Health and Hospital System. With the combining of the 3 budget units, I hope that more details of the ITCC plan can be presented to SEIU from ISD and ESA. As of right now, it's just a structure of a building with no room numbers. If I'm doing job A, I should be reclassed into doing job A. Also, with several newly approved positions to be filled, I hope it translates to transfer opportunities, promotional opportunities. If we need to hire from open competitive, that will be an indication that internal training is needed. I hope that ISD can work with ESA on that. Measure success in training, promotion, which will lead into future internal IT workforce. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me see if we have cards for any other speakers on consent calendar items. I do have the 4 cards regarding the fee issue. Supervisor Chavez, did you want to make your comments at this time?
Thank you. So on ISD, what I would like to ask is if I know that Dr. Smith, this is something that you've weighed in on in the past, and if we could get a written response from ESA and ISD on the comments that were just made to our committee, I would appreciate that. And the second thing that I'd like off agenda, and I don't know if John's here. Oh, sorry, John. You know what? Let me put my glasses on.
He's there.
There you are. Okay. So, John, what I wanted to ask is, it would be important for me to understand the expertise of the ESA staff that do the hiring in ISD. Understanding what their expertise is that gives them the capacity to be involved in that would be very helpful. And then for the CAN Center, again, off agenda, I'd like to get just an update on our strategy for overstrength hiring in that department, because I do believe that has been a strategy, and it seemed to not be applied in the staff report. Thank you.
All right. Supervisor Chavez, the chair would entertain a motion to approve the consent calendar and changes to the agenda as indicated.
Thank you. I will make that motion with the request for information to the committee. Thank
All
you.
right. Then a motion by Chavez, second by Simidian. Any additional comment? If not, then without objection, so ordered. So for those of you who are here from staff in particular for particular items, items 7, 8, 11, and 12, the ISD ESA report, the SSA report on child abuse, the internal auditor fiscal year 19 work plan, and the follow-up on internal audit report on workers' comp. Those items have been dispensed with. They have been approved on the consent calendar. Then items 9 and 10. 9 is the semi-annual report on countywide contracting, and 10 is the Office of Climate Sustainability report. Those two items have been deferred to the meeting in August. All right. Then that takes us to items 5 and 6. And do we have someone who can come down and present on this from the Sheriff's Department initially, because that is item 5. Those items are all Sheriff's Department items, and then we're going to do item 6, and then we're going to go to item 4. And then additionally, is there someone here at the dais who's going to present, or are we just going to do this directly between the board and the Sheriff's Department? All right. And I see Mr. Coelho joining us as well. Look at all this talent.
We also, Supervisor, have available to you our Chief Privacy Officer, Michael Shapiro, if you
Great.
have any questions of him as well.
Supervisor Chavez, don't want to cut the conversation short. Obviously, if you have comments or questions, want to accommodate those. That being said, one of the reasons for the delay on these items coming forward was so that I could take advantage of the opportunity to meet with the folks from the Sheriff's Department, as well as our Chief Privacy Officer, Mr. Shapiro, and Mr. Coelho from the County Counsel's Office. We have items 5A through Q in our packets. I have reviewed the revisions, and what I want to do is indicate just a couple of places, and in a minute I'm going to ask for a motion to forward all of these to our Board of Supervisors for approval by the full board so that we can say done, which I know will make everybody happy. There are still just a couple of outstanding issues that I think can be addressed between now and the time these will come back to our board. Are they scheduled to come back to our board next week or first meeting in August? August. Yeah, then that gives us plenty of time for what I think are relatively manageable changes, which I am expecting are going to be acceptable today based on other changes that have been offered. Having reviewed 5A through 5Q, all of which are in the Sheriff's Department, what I would ask the Sheriff's Department and the County Counsel's Office and our Chief Privacy Officer to do is work together to bring these back to the board as written with the following minor modifications, although they have some significant impact. I'm looking at packet page 35, the surveillance use policy for the Calio mobile bug. Under public access, number 7, what remains is the old language that says to the extent the data is part of a criminal investigation, it is exempt from disclosure under the California Public Records Act pursuant to Government Code Section 6254F. What I would like to ask here, and I'll ask it on a couple of other policies as well, is that the policy be amended to use the language which you have used in some of the other policies, that rather than purporting to set out in the policy statement what the law does or doesn't provide, is to indicate that you will check in with the County Counsel's Office, make a determination then about what the law does or doesn't provide, and act in conformity with the law. And I think that just what happened is in the back and forth, that change got picked up in half a dozen of the proposed policies, but it got left behind in half a dozen others. So that is one of the places where that is the case, and that is, again, 5C, the Calio mobile bug. That is also the case on 5I, and that's the surveillance use policy for court security video cameras. And again, it's the public, item 7, the public access language. I'm going to come back to that one. And same story on 5M, and that is the surveillance use policy for digital cameras and videos. 5M is in Mary, and again, it's item number 7, public access. And same story on 5O, surveillance use policy for digital voice recorders. And again, it's item number 7, public access language. Then same issue, and it's in 5S, surveillance use policy for the flash camera, although there it is still item 7. Same story with 5U. That's 5U, and that's the L3 in-car video recording system dash cam, item 7, public access again. And then same story on 5W as in wet, W as in wet, surveillance use policy for live scan machines and mobile ID fingerprint machines. That's again item number 7. Let me just ask whoever is going to take the lead today from the Sheriff's Department if you think you can accommodate those. Again, it's the language that you have already agreed to in other policies consistent with the conversations we've had with the County Counsel's Office.
Good afternoon, Supervisor. Is this mic on?
It is.
Okay. Assistant Sheriff Binder from the Sheriff's Office. I understand what your request is. It is the same language that we have in many of the other current policies before you, which is basically to indicate that we will confer with County Council when we get such a request, and we're happy to make that change for the other policies which we have approved for the ones you're talking about.
Thank you very much. If I could ask you to take a look at those, and then when, through the County Counsel's Office, we could ask you to work on that as well, so that when we come back in August, I'm hoping that we're good to go and we can get the full board to do this in a relatively expeditious language. One other issue that remained, or actually 2 issues that remain to be addressed. 5I, which is surveillance use policy for court security video cameras. Forgive me if I missed it. There was a lot of verbiage, but I didn't see anything about signage putting the public on notice that they were being surveilled in this way. I do recall we had some conversation about the fact that since this is on court property, that the courts understandably exercise a role in what is or isn't available in the way of signage and also in absorbing the costs. Where did this issue get left, if I may ask?
Yes, so Sheriff's Office has been in discussions with the judicial system over at the courthouse, the judges. I think they're amenable to the request. There's currently no signage, so we couldn't add it to the policy, but it's something that they are considering. I think they think it's a good idea. Sheriff's Office certainly thinks it's a good idea to have some sort of signage before you enter the courthouse buildings indicating that the premises are under video observation so that the public has adequate notice. Maybe between now and this August, when this goes to the board, we can get that signage up. If so, then we'll add it to the policy. We certainly think it's a good idea.
Well, what I'd like to do, Supervisor Chavez, is ask that we hold off forwarding that one to the full board until the issue of signage has been addressed. So we'll hold off and try and make sure that the fact that we're still looking at the policy provides some impetus for us all to get to a good outcome on the signage, okay? So that
Sure.
would be...
And I would just like to add that that would be a decision of the courts. We're simply managing the equipment, and it's their equipment and data, so we'll continue our discussions with them.
Right, and just so you understand, while I think, reasonable people have different interpretations about what a, quote, reasonable expectation of privacy is, and, public restrooms being at one end of the continuum and, in an open court another. I think, for example, people who are simply walking down the hall who look around and think no one else is there and want to give their beloved a hug or a squeeze should be able to do that without worrying that that's somehow going to be compromised. And If it turns out that there is a camera there, would be nice to let them know that. I just think whenever we can provide notice to folks of the fact that the cameras are in place, that's the appropriate policy choice. So we're going to hope that we can get to a good place there. The other one that I'd like to hold today, Supervisor Chavez, is 5Q, and this is the surveillance use policy for facial recognition software. And the facial recognition software, as I think many folks in the room would know, has a somewhat controversial backstory in some settings. I want to acknowledge, for the record, looking at the Sheriff's Department, that there were a number of very carefully crafted and specific pieces of language that were designed to avoid misuse of facial recognition software. That being said, this particular surveillance policy, I think, requires a little more analysis, and I'm going to ask Mr. Shapiro to work with our various offices as our Chief Privacy Officer to look at this issue. And for those who didn't catch it, within just the last few weeks, there was a dust-up with Amazon offering to sell facial recognition software and equipment to governments across the country. My understanding of what you're proposing and the limited uses that you are proposing is that it is not, I want to underscore not, the matter that got quite a bit of attention and controversy. I think Amazon was suggesting that the technology might actually be embedded in people's body cams, which is not what you're proposing. So, to you, Supervisor Chavez.
So could you talk a little bit about what needs to be worked on?
Well, I want to on this one. So on the prior one, court security cameras, it's really just a signage question.
That.
On this one, if I knew for sure what I thought needed to be worked on, I wouldn't be pulling the Chief Privacy Officer in. But essentially, what I'm going to ask the Chief Privacy Officer, and thank you because I think it probably will be helpful if I'm a little more direct, is Chief Privacy Officer, do you have any privacy concerns for members of the public with this item as it stands going forward, and are there ways to address those? Not looking for an answer today, looking for you to have a little opportunity to spend some time on this and then come back to us with an off-agenda report after conversation with County Counsel's Office and the Sheriff's Department. That would be, I think, my request, Supervisor.
And is your I think all of this discussion has been really important, and I'm glad that you brought it to us. I think the reason I'm just pressing on this a little bit is that I want to better understand if there are concerns that there's a way to have a conversation about what the pros and cons are of the way that you would address concerns, whoever is working on that. And the reason I think this is important is that, interestingly enough, I think one of the points that Joe's raised is that it feels like we're in a surveillance society, and being able to have really open conversations about that, I think, is important. I also recognize that in some instances, we as a government entity may really be interested in using these kinds of technologies to be very protective of certain situations. And one example that I've been thinking a lot about lately is workplace violence, and what happens when you know that we have a restraining order or a temporary restraining order, and whether or not in some instances we need to be more proactive, recognizing that the point that's raised is all the faces that get cleared while you're trying to protect against maybe one person. So anyway, better understanding the pros and cons of whatever recommendations get made would be helpful to understand.
Sure, and Chief Privacy Officer Mike Shapiro, so I'll certainly work on that report. There are certainly some benefits that can come from facial recognition technology as long as it's conducted in a responsible way. And so my report will provide recommendations in those regards.
And then with all of these, this is a really good one to take a look at, but with all of these, just making sure that whatever our overall policies are, if we are ever making changes, especially as it relates to record retention, because that's actually the area that I get most nervous about, is the who keeps what for how long. So in any case, thank you.
Thank you. And let me just, with respect to Mr. Shapiro's future engagement, Mr. Shapiro, you've been with us how long?
About 8 months.
Yeah. And so the work we did on the requirement for surveillance use policies predates your arrival. I, for one, am delighted that you're here now and that we can, I hope, use some of your time and your expertise to help us reviewing these on a going forward basis. So We candidly had relied perhaps more than was reasonable on the county counsel's office. Appreciate their willingness to step in, and it's been very helpful. But I think having now the additional benefit of the chief privacy officer in the conversations is going to be helpful. So again, the motion that I would look for today, Supervisor Chavez, if you're amenable, is to forward items 5A through Q to the full board with a favorable recommendation contingent only on the signage language, contingent only on the public access language that I referenced earlier, which I think we can work out because we've already used that language. And with the exception of the two policies that I mentioned, 5Q, which deals with facial recognition, and the other item which dealt with the court security cameras. Does that work for the Sheriff's Department?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Supervisor.
And just to get you on the record here on purpose, does that mean that the Sheriff's Department, when the item comes to the full board, is prepared to support the adoption of and compliance with these use policies going forward?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Yeah, I want to just tip you, you can expect me to ask that question again when we all meet in the full board chambers, and I didn't want that to come to you as a surprise. And I'm hopeful and expecting that the Sheriff's Department will, knowing that that question is coming, be prepared to give us a good, clear answer in the board meeting. Okay?
Sounds good.
Supervisor Chavez, motion. We have a motion from Chavez and a second, but before we take action, we're going to hear from Scott Largent on this issue. Mr. Largent, would you like to come forward, please? And as you know, you have 2 minutes, sir.
Hi, good afternoon, Scott Largent. The overlapping policy that we have, I truly believe that our policy should apply in all of the courthouses for the security cameras. That's not the case right now, though. It's up to the courts. So they can select what they want to film, what they want to keep. I've been trying to get their policy from the courts, and they haven't been cooperating with me. I've been trying to get it through the state. There's really nothing set in stone on how long they keep video footage. There was other footage with Susan's incident that disappeared in 2 weeks. So I find that really strange. And you've heard what the other gentleman said right here is it's up to the courts. They really don't have their act together when it comes to things. And please don't get nervous. This is a hand scanner. So this device right here, I'm allowed to use this in the courthouse. I'm allowed to go into the file room. I'm allowed to scan and use this device. Susan's being prosecuted for taking a picture, scanning it that way, because technically you can't use a camera in the courthouse. This device right here, I've been hassled about using it, even though they say it's okay. So then what I wanted to do is I said, hey, I want something in writing that says that I can use this. What type of policy do you have? They can't produce a policy with this thing. So every time I go in there and scan a court file, I risk being prosecuted over this, which is very strange. They can do whatever they want in the courthouse. It's just like these rules that they're putting together right here. They can just make up the law and then tell the sheriff's deputies to go enforce it and do that. And I just don't think that's right. So I think it's something you guys maybe need to look at, that the policies overlap. And it puts the deputies in a bad position when you have judges that are upset with people like me or Susan Bassey or Victorious that are court watchers coming in and out of there. They kind of want to set us up to fail. Susan was, there was a meeting that was on the 8th floor, and it was a violation of the Brown Act. It was a remote meeting that they couldn't have there. Susan is alleged to have taken a picture of the door on the 8th floor there. They zoomed in to her iPad, and figured out what she was doing on the iPad, if she was taking the picture or not. It just seems really shady. And now that video has disappeared. It's strange. I'm a little worried about it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Supervisor, we have a motion on item number 5. Second by Semidian. Any objection? Seeing and hearing none. Approved unanimously. We'll forward to the board with the various contingencies and exceptions that have been noted. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
And Mr. Quayle, one day this will be done. That takes us to item number 6. And Supervisor Chavez, on item number 6, I'm just going to ask that we continue this item until the meeting in August, our committee meeting in August. And that's because we literally did not get at least half of these until 36 hours ago. And, again, folks, these require a fair amount of care and attention from our board and our committee in particular. One of the reasons we're doing these here at the committee is to try and save a little time at the board by having these things thoroughly vetted. We really do need to see them ahead of time if we're going to do our due diligence in terms of reviewing the language carefully. So I'm just going to ask, again, I know this is a first time through the process for a lot of folks, but we need to get the things well in advance if we're going to do due diligence. And I am going to be asking the Chief Privacy Officer to be part of this process going forward. So, all right. So Supervisor Chavez, can I get a motion to continue item number 6? Motion from Chavez, second by Semidian, and without objection, so ordered. Thank you very much. And in fairness, Supervisor Chavez, when I say half of them arrived late, that means, of course, half of them arrived on time. So for those who did, thank you, and I'm sorry you got swept up in the delay as a result. All right, thank you again. That takes us back to item number 4. I want to thank those of you who waited on that item. I think we have a presentation from staff. Come on up. And again, if you'd like to speak to this item, please fill out a card, hand it to our clerk. And as I said earlier, and Supervisor Chavez was agreeable, I think on this item we're going to allow up to 3 minutes per speaker, just so folks don't feel rushed given the nature of the content. All right. Dr. Smith, am I looking to Ms. Gallegos?
Yes.
Ms. Gallegos, I'm looking to you.
Good afternoon, Sylvia Gallegos, Deputy County Executive, and I have with me Kurt Gerard, who is our Planning and Development Director, and Elizabeth Pianca, who is the lead for the General Government section in County Council. The matter before you is a draft Affordable Housing Impact Ordinance, and before I have Mr. Gerard speak through the highlights of this draft ordinance, before we seek your input, I wanted to take a moment to set the table, if I may. So if you'll recall, on May 1st, we had presented to the board a nexus study, an addendum, the outcome of outreach we had conducted, and some recommendations. And we had at the time recommended to the board that we proceed with an impact fee ordinance for academic space and residential development on the campus in the unincorporated areas of the county, and propose scheduling consideration of a commercial fee for the areas of the unincorporated county outside of Stanford lands, and also residential land outside of Stanford for 2019. The board did have some conversation and continued the discussion to May 8th, the following week. And at that time, the board did, in fact, approve direction to the administration and council to prepare a draft affordable housing impact fee for academic space development on Stanford campus, and asked us to incorporate some features, including phasing of a fee, indexing to some measure, the ability to build instead of enacting a fee or paying a fee, possible credits for building, establish a floor for the fee of $68.50, and then a ceiling that relates to the maximum supported by the study of $143.10. And you also asked us to prepare a draft inclusionary zoning ordinance. We do have a draft ordinance of that as well, and we will present both to the Hewlett Committee next week on June 21st. So with that sort of setup, I'd like to ask the director to present some of the features of this draft ordinance.
Thank you very much, Kirk Gerard. I'll go over the principal elements that are reflected in the ordinance. The ordinance is attached, and the adopting resolution of the ordinance is also attached to the staff report. The ordinance would apply, and the impact fee would be assessed to what's termed net new building area on the campus, and that's any area that does not have a certificate of occupancy granted by the county as of the operative date of the ordinance. It would apply to all academic spaces, and we're defining those as all academic construction except for housing and parking lot facilities. The range established by the board and the floor and the ceiling has also been used as a phase-in metric, in that in the first year the proposal would be $68.50 a square foot assessed, escalating to the ceiling after year one to $143.10 a square foot. There's an exemption for pipeline projects. So any project that has received a building permit or whose application is deemed complete at the time of the operative date of the ordinance would be assessed the impact fee, and that the fee would be indexed annually based on the published indexing rate in the Engineering News Record and the San Francisco construction cost basket. Stanford, under the ordinance, would be given an option to pay the mitigation fee or construct affordable units. And we've included Table 2 in the staff report to show if Stanford opted to build an affordable unit, how much academic space could be granted to them without having to pay an impact fee. And the table shows two rates based on the floor and the ceiling estimate for the impact fee. If they built an extremely low income and the impact fee was $68.50 a square foot, then they would effectively get 5,495 square feet of academic space that would not be assessed a fee. If they build a low-income unit at that $68.50 impact fee rate, then they would get lesser quantity of exempted academic square footage at 3,729. And then there's a corresponding column for the higher level of impact fees and what that would mean in terms of offset of academic space impact fees. Now, the table shows that Stanford would have an option of paying the fee or paying building an equivalent cost in affordable housing, so that the fee and the construction of affordable unit is on par under this table. But the full board suggested an interest in providing some incentive to Stanford to build a affordable unit as opposed to paying the fee. And what staff's determined is that there are no easy formulas to adopt, and the formula that might be appropriate to Stanford for the construction of units in a 6-mile radius of the university would have to be researched to understand what the appropriate balance point would be that would effectively incentivize the construction of units. So it's one of the aspects that staff is looking for direction from the committee is the extent to which staff should continue to research that point and bring it back to the full board. All the funds that would be derived from this impact fee program would be put into an affordable housing fund and earmarked to develop housing in the 6-mile radius of Stanford University. And there are some terms that apply to the restrictions that we've placed on those affordable units. There's a requirement that for each proposed construction, Stanford would be submitting a plan to the county. The county would evaluate to determine if it met the requirements of the ordinance, and for example would propose the mix of affordable units and the location, and that the county would have discretion over whether or not that was consistent or not with the stated terms of the ordinance. So that concludes my report, my outline of the major features of the ordinance. Thank you.
Ms. Gallegos, any additional comments from anyone at the?
We'll be ready to respond to questions, I assume, after you invite the speakers up.
Thank you. Supervisor Chavez, it is my inclination to invite the speakers up at this time. So let me ask Jessica Von Bork and David Demarest and Jean Snyder and Catherine Palter to all make their way up. And we're going to ask clerk to set the timer at 3 minutes. Thank you very much. Come right up. And it's Ms. Von Bork, yes? There is a microphone there. It doesn't look like there is, but if you speak right up, we'll hear you loud and clear. And if we can't, we'll ask the clerk to turn the volume up. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. As you mentioned, I'm Jessica Von Bork. I'm the Director of Land Use for Stanford, and we really appreciate the opportunity to speak before you today.
And sure enough, let me ask the clerk if we can turn the volume up just a notch or two, please. Go right ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to highlight a key request that we would like to make this afternoon. It does not appear to us that the draft ordinance conforms to the Board of Supervisors' May 8th policy directions. To enable us to develop a proposal that meets the board's objectives, we ask that the committee clarify the following 3 points that we heard on May 8th. First, the $68.50 per square foot fee amount that Supervisor Chavez identified in her motion, we believe, did not assume that affordable housing demand or construction would be constricted or restricted to a 6-mile radius from Stanford campus. The May 8th staff report shows this fee reflects costs to provide affordable housing over a broader area within the county. Second, the $68.50 per square foot fee is calculated based on the demand from extremely low, very low, and low income households, which are less than 80% AMI. The May 8th staff report makes it clear that the calculation did not include demand from moderate income households. Third, the board expressed strong interest in seeing incentives to actually see affordable housing being built rather than a fee paid. These 3 policy directions are not reflected in the draft ordinance and staff report that are before you today. Instead, the draft ordinance jumps from a $68.50 per square foot fee to the $143 fee that assumes affordable housing demand and construction is restricted to a 6-mile radius and is calculated for moderate income households. Moreover, the ordinance sets many restrictions and obstacles that would serve as a disincentive rather than an incentive to build. What we ask the committee today is to clarify its May 8th direction to staff in order to ensure that revisions to the draft ordinance reflect the board's policy direction. Again, thank you for your time. We wanted to respect the time allotted to us. Obviously, I have a lot of time here, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, or we can follow through with the rest of my team.
Thank you. Appreciate your willingness to be available for questions if they arise, and I'm guessing there will be a few questions today, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Demarest, I believe you're up next, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is David Demarest, and I've been a vice president at Stanford for the last 13 years, working on a range of issues affecting our communities, our neighbors, and the region. We appreciate very much your willingness to hear our comments on the Stanford Affordable Housing Fee. We agree quite strenuously that the housing issue is a crisis. Housing has been and continues to be a serious priority for the university. The thousands of affordable housing units that we provide and subsidize for our graduate students, combined with about 250 below market rate units we provide for our workforce and other low-income community members, makes Stanford one of the largest affordable housing providers in Santa Clara County. In our GUP application, we propose to continue adding to our housing stock, both for our students and for our workforce. You've received a letter from us raising serious issues with the method KMA used to calculate the maximum fee that the county would impose on Stanford's proposed academic growth. And you'll hear more about that this morning or this afternoon. Our critique of the fee calculation methodology should not be construed as any indication of less than a serious commitment on Stanford's part to make a significant contribution to the creation of affordable housing. My colleagues and I are very interested in having a thoughtful dialogue with you as to how to do that in the most effective way, and we will do our fair share. I want to emphasize that our focus is to find ways to actually get more affordable housing built, and to do that through a process that gets that housing created sooner and into the market faster. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for your comments. Jean Snyder, to be followed by Catherine Palter. Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Jean Snyder, and I'm Associate Vice President of Stanford University in the Real Estate Division. We have several concerns with the KMA Nexus study that we wrote about to you, and I will be speaking to one in particular this afternoon, which is their methodology for calculating the subsidy required to build Stanford-related affordable housing units. Their methodology greatly overstates the permanent subsidy required to build units. KMA's impact fee is derived by first calculating an affordability gap for each type of unit, which is assumed to be the difference between total costs and sources of capital to build that unit. Our concern is that KMA only identifies 2 sources of capital when there are many more: tax credits and a conventional loan supported by the project's first year of income. KMA does not account for an indisputable third source of funds, which is current and future cash flow. By omitting this third source, KMA overstates the subsidy by a factor of 4. Future cash flows can be projected and expressed in current dollars through a present value calculation. This is in fact the industry standard for how to evaluate real estate projects, including affordable housing projects. We understand that with deeply discounted affordable housing, and we're talking 30 to 40% of AMI or below, rents barely cover operating expenses and there may not be future cash flow. It is critical to note, however, that Stanford-related housing has an average AMI of close to 60%, which is the low-income category. At this level, there is current and future cash flow from rental increases, an amortizing conventional loan that is eventually paid off, and tax-free syndications that often happen every 15 years. In fact, this cash flow helps repay the soft debt that is provided to almost every low-income affordable housing projects, loans from jurisdictions, housing trusts, even land seller financing. These soft debt lenders record deeds of trusts against the property and expect to be paid back over time. What we ask the committee to do is request that staff work with Stanford and affordable housing experts to review and correct the calculation of the subsidy required to support Stanford-related housing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I believe our final speaker is Catherine Palter.
Good afternoon. My name is Catherine Palter, and I'm with Stanford University.
Ms. Palter, did you not get the white ensemble memo today from the...
They left me off it.
Okay.
Yeah, they did.
Well, we don't want to count that against your time. Go right ahead.
Okay, thanks. I would like to speak to you about the advantages of working collaboratively on a development agreement in order to bring affordable housing to the community far sooner and more effectively than would occur without such an agreement. Under an ordinance or a condition of approval, Stanford would contribute affordable housing fees over time as we add academic facilities. Because we anticipate that it will take 17 years to complete our academic development, these fees would be metered out over the course of 2 decades. In addition, the county would need to wait until sufficient fees are collected to support a housing project in order to disperse the funding to affordable housing developers, resulting in a lag of many years. However, through a development agreement, Stanford could front-load affordable housing benefits that are not dependent on the rate of Stanford's academic growth. Under this structure, Stanford and the county could work together to provide needed affordable housing benefits well in advance of any demand for affordable housing from Stanford's 2018 general use permit. Stanford could commit to providing an agreed-upon number of units rather than only paying a fee. We are currently preparing an affordable housing proposal that will include creation of housing units for low-income workers on our lands, and we will be able to discuss it with you within a few weeks. We ask to enter into these negotiations out of a conviction that we share common goals to benefit our communities, and that together we can craft solutions that will provide far greater benefits than can be achieved through conflict. We've kept our comments brief, but as mentioned before, we're available to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. Let me ask first if there's any, Supervisor Chavez, what I'm going to suggest is that we go this way. First, ask staff if they have any additional comments at this time. Then, questions from you and me, and truly questions, although they may be deep in the body of what we've got. And then comments and or direction if that's desired after that sequence. Does that sound like it works for you? Good. Then let me check with staff and if you have additional comments you want to share following those comments, please do. And it seems pretty clear that Supervisor Chavez and I are going to have some questions for you.
Good afternoon. Responding to some of the statements that were made, as it relates to the comment with respect to the critique of the methodology, I want to underscore, and they note this themselves on page 6 of the report, that the critique isn't specific to the methodology that was incorporated in our report, but rather to all nexus studies. And so, in effect, if you don't agree with the validity of this, the analysis and the methodology, then in effect, you're not agreeing with the validity of any of the nexus studies done in this area. And we will have David Dozema, the consultant, prepare a written response and provide it in the record when it goes to Hewlett on June 21st. So I wanted to underscore that it was a criticism of all nexus studies. And in fact, we did use the standard methodology. It wouldn't be safe to deviate, from the standard methodology employed by other jurisdictions in this area. With regard to the report and whether it's responsive to the direction on May 8th, staff concludes, in fact, we are responsive to the direction given to us, including a desire to have, a phasing of a fee, indexing to some standard. We do give the option to build. We are continuing. We had extensive discussions internally with respect to trying to incentivize building on campus or building in general versus paying a fee. And what I'll say is that it's a very complicated matter, and so we are interested in engaging in a discussion with them prior to going to the board in August about how we could structure some incentive for them. So I want to acknowledge there isn't that incentive yet. We did have discussions, but we are interested in engaging them in that conversation. With respect to the process, we have, it's a 3-month process by the time we get to the board at the end of August, if indeed we comply with the timeline set forth previously to you, including 2 stops at 2 board committees, possibly more stops depending upon the action of committees, and also the Planning Commission and then the board. So we think there is plenty of time to engage in a conversation with respect to this draft ordinance. We welcome your comments. With respect to a development agreement, we are bringing June 19th, this coming Tuesday, the authority to enter into development agreements. It would take effect after 1 reading in 30 days, so by the end of July.
And excuse the interruption, but that's a request for the authority to enter into development agreements generically. Not as to a specific project or application.
That's correct.
Thank you.
And obviously that would be dependent upon the board and the applicant expressing interest in doing so. So with that, we are prepared to respond to any specific questions you may have.
Thank you. The Dr. Smith, is somebody singing happy birthday to you up here at the dais? Is that what's going on? All right. Not to worry. All right, thank you. Supervisor Chavez, I got a couple of questions. All right, thank you. My acknowledgement to staff right up front that some of these are going to be seemingly a little bit disconnected, but they're what about this and what about that kinds of questions. And first, I just want to make sure I'm looking at, did we get an updated copy of the very first page of the document? Are there 2 different first pages for item 4A? Is this ringing a bell with anybody? Do you have no idea what I'm talking about? Okay, that's good to know. Then I'm looking at packet page 14, 4A, and it says page 1 of 8 at the bottom, and at the top it says final formatting of the draft ordinance will be completed prior to consideration by the Board of Supervisors. And in an unnumbered section, because we haven't numbered the sections yet, but item 2 at the bottom, it says, in order to address the demand for affordable housing generated by the construction of academic space, a fee on the construction of academic space as described in this ordinance will assist in the provision of affordable housing for the low-income households that are required by the workforce associated with development in the Stanford Community Plan area. Are we reading the same language? And my question is, should it say for the low-income households, or should it say for the extremely low, very low, low-income, and moderate-income households, or is it really meant to be specific to that one group? Because I think we're using low-income as having a specific term of art. Forgive me for proofreading, but that's kind of what I'm doing on this one. And if the answer is you want to get back to us at some other time, that's also fine. I just want to raise the issue.
Elizabeth Pianca, Lead Deputy County Counsel. The intent is consistent with Section 1A to apply to very low and moderate income households, and that change could be made to Section 2.
Thank you. I'll just say this. As someone intimately involved in the conversation, I did not think it communicated that, so I would encourage you to take a look at that language, okay? Then on and forgive me, I'm trying to reference page numbers here. On what is, I believe, page 2 of the document, at the top of the document it says, the Board of numeral 2, the Board of Supervisors hereby establishes the academic space affordable housing impact mitigation fee amount as follows, and then there's a year. Are we on the same page at least? lower right-hand corner, mine says page 2 of the resolution establishing draft 6/12/2018. That's why I'm just. Are we there, all on the same page? Because number 3 says the fee shall take effect 60 days after the adoption of the resolution. Then number 4 talks about for each year following the operative date. And then there's some language later in the document that references operative dates and when this thing takes effect. Could somebody walk through in just the plainest of language, please, if the board were to take action pursuant to this at the $68.50 level, when does what happen? So let's say, what's the second meeting in August for the sake of discussion? August 28th? If the board took action to do that on August 28th, what happens on what sequence? So everybody's clear about that. At least I'm clear about that. So.
Elizabeth Bianca, Lead Deputy County Counsel again. Since we're not certain exactly when the board will take action on the ordinance and adoption of the resolution, the ultimate goal is to have both the resolution and the effective date of the ordinance tied together.
Let me interrupt for just a second because this is part of my confusion. Is the effective date the same as the operative date?
The operative date is defined in the ordinance as the first day of the month following the effective date.
Okay, so let me try it this way. If the second meeting in August is the 29th, is that what somebody said? Excuse me? 28th, thank you. Then if we had an ordinance, it would require 2 readings. Am I remembering that correctly?
Correct.
So we would have a first reading then, and then we would have a second reading, which has to be at least some number of days later?
So working off of this hypothetical, the second reading would be September 11th.
Okay, and then my recollection is that typically our ordinances take effect 30 days after the second reading, but my recollection could be wrong.
Yes.
That's correct.
It's correct. So at that point, we would count 30 days from September the 11th.
So the ordinance would have its effective date would then be October 11th.
Okay.
And the
And then-
operative date
November 1st.
would be November 1st, so the beginning of the month following the effective date.
Okay. I actually think, and maybe it's just me, I think that's now pretty clear. You have an ordinance, you approve it once, then you bring it back, you approve it twice. 30 days later, it's effective, but the operative date for the fee is the first day of the following month. If I got that part right?
Correct.
Okay. I will just say I'm not sure that's altogether clear in the ordinance language we have, and I understand that part of that lack of clarity is because you don't know when the board's going to do what it's going to do, but I would just ask that you take a look at that language again to make that clear, because I think it's a thing everybody's going to want to know, and we don't want to have any debate about it if and when we get to that place, and I think it's a knowable and describable thing, but I didn't find that clear. Then on paragraph 5 of that same page, there's reference to depositing funds in an affordable housing fund as described in the Stanford Community Plan Academic Space Affordable Housing Impact Mitigation Fee Ordinance. And that, I gather, was used because there is such a thing and it is called by that name, yes? The reason I'm asking is that that is not one of the terms of art. I've got an academic space affordable housing impact fee that is defined later in the definitions. I'm just trying to make sure I know what the definitions refer to. And again, forgive me, I know these are sort of technical questions, but the details will matter pretty clearly in this.
Elizabeth Bianca, Lead Deputy County Counsel. Affordable Housing Fund is defined in the ordinance.
It is, and is that, but that's different than the Affordable Housing Impact Mitigation Fee ordinance, which I think makes reference to a different ordinance, yes?
I think it's consistency with the terminology, Stanford Community Plan, academic space, affordable housing, impact mitigation fee ordinance to be consistently applied in the resolution in section 5.
I don't think we need to untangle it today. Could I just ask you to take a look at that and make sure that we've got identical language or parallel language where we need it?
Yeah.
Then a question that's going to seem flip, perhaps, but is actually quite important in the context of the debate about all this. If I look at the definitions on what is listed now as page 2 of 8, or in my case, packet page 15, there is a definition of academic space. And it says academic space means all building uses except building uses for housing and parking facilities within the Stanford University Community Plan area. And Mr. Gerard, you were kind enough to touch on this issue. I just want to be very clear that it means anything other than housing and parking.
That's correct.
All right, and I'm going to embarrass myself by saying I know that there's a Subway and a Jamba Juice at Tresidder on the campus. So for the record, in this case, the Subway and the Jamba Juice would be considered academic space.
Under the category of academic support facilities, yes.
Okay, thank you. I think it just, I think a colloquial reading of the term academic space might not necessarily include everything that's there on the campus, and I just think you've called it out very clearly, and I know this has been part of the discussion about our current $35 fee and the pushback we've had from the university about what it does or doesn't apply to. So I wanted to make sure we got that squared away. Then on page 4 of 8, and this is packet page 17, we have some language again about operative date in a couple of places. And again, that's just the piece where I think we can be a little more clear about how that all plays out. Looking at the last section on that page, academic space, affordable housing impact mitigation fee, this is again page 4 of 8, packet page 17 for the record. Mr. Gerard, I think you made mention of this, but I just want to underscore it, that the approach taken here, and I'm reading verbatim, is the fee imposed by this ordinance shall be collected at the time of the issuance of the building permit. That is a change from the current practice, as I understand it, which is that fees that are collected for housing pursuant to the conditions of approval in the 2000 GUP are currently collected prior to the issuance of a certificate of occupancy, yes?
Yes, that's correct.
Got it. I'm now on page 5 of 8. Essentially, there's a protest/appeal process, and it makes the county executive the final arbiter in a protest or appeal. Do I have that correct? I'm looking at packet page 18, page 5 of 8.
That is correct.
So it's an administrative process, and ultimately, if there were a determination that within our organization, the decider, to borrow a phrase, would be the county executive. Okay. Then under exemptions, on that same page, it says this ordinance shall not apply to applications for academic space development that are deemed complete or have an approved building permit prior to the operative date of this ordinance. And I gather by this that essentially what you're trying to do is say for projects that are already in the pipeline as defined by this section, they will have escaped the imposition of any new fee, and the old requirements, if any, will apply. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
Okay. When it comes time for comments, I want to come back to that one, so I'll write a note to myself. Page 7 of 8, the very bottom of the page, there's some language about eligibility in households, and it says no household may, says E at the bottom of the page 7 of 8. No household may begin occupancy of an affordable unit until the household has been determined to be eligible to occupy that unit. Okay, so that means you don't get to move into a qualifying unit until you've proved that you're a qualifying applicant for that unit. Then it goes on to say affordable units shall be rented to income eligible households at an affordable housing cost for the entire term of the affordable housing restriction. And then it says the county shall establish standards for determining household income, maximum occupancy, affordable housing cost, provision, so on and so forth. What happens when somebody starts to earn more than is allowable in terms of income eligibility? So, you know, not an issue perhaps if somebody moves from, say, low income status to moderate income status, because you've still got units. But I'm particularly mindful of the fact that we might have folks who met the moderate income criteria when they moved in. Then over time, we hope their lives get even better, they make a little more money, and they're no longer in that income criteria. What happens to them then?
That would be a policy decision of the county. There is no uniform treatment in the affordable housing world. Some grant programs have specific requirements. But in general, that case is a tough case, because somebody could be forcing eviction just because they did find themselves in a better position. If the board was interested in setting the terms for that in the ordinance, staff could do research with Office of Supportive Housing, come up with a range of possible alternatives, or provide some general direction, so that would be part of the program guidelines.
I'm not sure what I think about that issue yet, truly, but the thing that I wanted to make sure, and I'll look to County Counsel's office on this point, is I want to be sure that the language that is in the proposed ordinance does not establish a de facto policy without our knowing it. So just to be very clear and to do it on the record, the language as written now does not suggest or require that someone who suddenly, well, or not so suddenly, starts to earn more than their previous income eligible requirement is to be denied further use of the premises. It does not do that. Am I correct in that reading?
The way I read it currently is it basically defers that to the standards established by the county executive.
Got it. All right. Well, then I'm going to leave that as an important issue to be resolved at some point in the future. But as I say, I appreciate your ability today to say, no, it does not attempt to address that at the moment. A question I have is the indexing, which I believe is proposed annually, is tied to a construction cost indicator. Is construction cost the right indicator? Because housing costs, of course, are a function of both construction costs but land cost, and materials and labor and all of that. But the materials and labor I would anticipate are built into construction cost increases. The land cost, not so much. Now maybe because that's by definition, land is not part of the construction cost. I would think colloquially maybe you're going to tell me that the construction cost index does incorporate that, in which case my question will be moot. Any thoughts on that one? In places where the land cost is minimal, that may be a not terribly critical issue, but in places like the North County and the area surrounding Stanford, where land cost is such a significant part of what makes housing expensive, I just want to make sure if we're going to use an indicator, that's the right one. And if the answer is, gee, let us take a look at some other opportunities, that's fine as well. I don't know if there's another housing CPI that reflects both land and construction or not, and I'm not professing any expertise here. It was just a question that occurred to me as I was making my way through the document.
I don't know.
Okay.
We'll have to do research and come back to you on how land costs are reflected in the ENR indexes.
Thank you. And or whether they should be, shouldn't be. Is there another index? Those are all questions for me. Supervisor Chavez, that's my first round of questions. Thank you for your patience. I'll turn to you.
Thank you. So first of all, it was helpful to listen to Supervisor, I almost called you doctor, I don't know why, Supervisor Simitian's questions. And the one request I would like to make is, as these questions are getting resolved, really as it relates to affordable housing overall, it would be important to determine where that's aligned with what we're already doing relative to our own housing department, how we're thinking about this relative to Measure A, because a number of these questions, if we haven't answered them already, we probably need to. I know we have some flexibility under different categories of resources that we're investing, but in some of them, I'm not sure we have given it the kind of scrutiny that maybe it's time to do, in part because we're relatively new in our programming. But I wanted to start with a very broad question, and this really is for Stanford. And I just want to say I did not have a chance to read the letter. We got it last night at 6:30, and we're in the middle of our budget hearings and all kinds of catching up hearings, so I didn't have an opportunity to read this. But I'm very interested in you prioritizing the top 2 or 3 reflections of obstacles to building affordable housing on your campus as defined. I think Ms. Van Borg, that's something that you raised, and I'm interested in understanding how that's defined. Thank you.
Thanks, Supervisor. And just for the record, it's Jessica Von Borg who's coming back up to the microphone. Welcome again.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to answer that question. We've identified a couple disincentives that
Ms.
we feel.
Von Borg, I am going to ask you to speak up just a little
louder.
bit.
I can speak louder too.
Great, go to it.
It can be a combination of the both. But there are a couple things. First, how the ordinance lays it out is it's a 99-year commitment for those units to remain affordable, whereas the market typically is about 55 years. So that's feeling a little bit heavy for us at the moment. In addition to that, the process feels a bit onerous. There are a couple, as staff had outlined for you in their presentation, there are a couple steps that need to be taken. So once we have an affordable housing project we like to bring forward, we have to come up with an affordable housing plan, and that plan needs to meet a couple criteria. So there are a lot of checks and balances along the way that from an entitlement perspective are pretty time-consuming and onerous. I think, as if staff's open to a conversation about, and it sounds like they are, about how we can begin to look at streamlining processes and changing those time-frames, that's something we would be more amenable to.
And the disincentive, just to be clear, on the 99-year, the 99-year affordability covenant is, you consider that a disincentive to investing in affordable housing or building affordable housing on the campus?
That's correct.
Okay, and then I just wanted to make sure I heard that. And then on the second issue that you raised, are you very specifically saying if the timeline for processing permits was more constrained from what you perceive as X timeline, and I don't know what the staff thinks that is or what you think that is, to Y timeline, that would be more of an incentive? Because there's a disincentive essentially to building affordable housing on the campus based on the way we've structured this?
Yeah, I mean, I will pause and see if my colleagues have a different perspective. But generally speaking, from an entitlement process and working with local agencies and things like that to get affordable housing built, what we're hearing from a lot of affordable housing developers is that the timeline of the process to get from your application in to an approval date is meaningful. You have financing that you need to get, and time to market is important. And by elongating that process, it's a disincentive.
So very concretely, what you're saying is if you constrain the timeline, it's not a disincentive? Because let me just say this. I was concerned when you came up and used the term obstacles, that these are disincentives. I really want to understand concretely what the problem is we're trying to solve. That's why I'm asking you the question.
I think those two items I pointed out are things that we'd be happy to have a conversation with staff on further. I see Catherine coming up behind me so she can highlight as something that I might have missed. But those are also identified in the letter that you had received. So hopefully Catherine can clarify or course correct anything I
Thank you.
Add to. I think the way we were reading it is it really looked like a come forward with affordable housing, and if it's at least as good as providing a fee, you can go ahead and do it. And then there were all these, requirements to building that housing. Whereas what we were hearing on May 8th is there really should be an incentive to building this housing, and so, there's a presumption that it is better than paying the fee, and that's not what we were seeing in that ordinance as it's drafted right now.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Thank you both. Other questions, Supervisor Chavez?
Yes, thank you. Just a couple of others, and these are really for staff, and I may come back to Stanford for clarification on some of this. One is I am really interested in having KMA respond very directly to both the comments made today, and actually there were some at the initial hearing that I didn't see if KMA did respond, but I'd be interested in getting their feedback. As it relates to the current GUP that exists, there's a GUP that exists. All of the work that you're presenting to us is post that GUP, and I wanted to make sure I understood that you said that there would be consideration for projects in the pipeline, and what I'm understanding is those projects that were in the pipeline are projects that the county's already had a partnership and things have gone through a process, and we're not going to hold up or impact anything that is already covered, per se.
Supervisor Chavez, would you mind if I jumped in just
Please.
to clarify a little? I think depending on where things are in the development process, in the pipeline, so to speak, there are different numbers that people would give you, so it's hard to get a single number about, well, how much authorized use is left under the existing GUP. But I think it's fair to say that it's somewhere between 200,000 and 600,000 square feet that is sort of yet to be used up, and depending again a little on where it is in the process. And your question, because I have the same question, is important to me, because what the staff is proposing is that if it's already at a certain point in the pipeline, it would be exempted, but that other development in years to come pursuant to the existing GUP, if it hasn't yet met those milestones, would be subject to the new fee. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
Say that again.
So there are some projects that are so the existing GUP has some unused capacity. Whatever that number is, the first part of that unused capacity is projects that are already in the pipeline. And would you read the definition again, the language of where they are, Mr. Gerard, from the...
Where the application for the project has been deemed complete, and that's a term of art for discretionary approvals, or a building permit has been issued for the project.
But that for a project I'm going to pick that no one has put in an application for, or that has not been deemed complete, or for which there isn't a building permit, but that is yet to be developed under the existing authority of the existing GUP, some of that unused capacity, the staff proposal is that the fee would apply to projects that come forward under the GUP, the existing GUP's authorization for 2 million square feet that is yet to be exhausted unless it meets one of those milestones.
That's correct.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
And if I can just add one other thing, just to put it another way, I think it's important to conceptualize the ordinance here is really independent of the GUP authorization process.
Meaning the GUP authorization for the next GUP,
Correct.
if and when approved.
And even for that matter, the current GUP as is being described, the ordinance takes effect for anything that's not basically deemed complete as is defined in
Supervisor Chavez, if I am butting into your question too
That's
much,
all right.
just
Butt
push
away,
me back.
so to speak.
But I think the reason I've been thinking about this is that there are two different issues here. One's legal and one's a policy judgment. The legal question is, how soon could this take effect? And staff is telling us it could take effect after that sequence of events, and that is a legal matter. And then the policy question is, do you want it to take effect for projects that come forward under the existing GUP, or do you want it to take effect sometime later? And that's a policy judgment that's different than the legal judgment. And that's why I've been circling the same question that you have, I think.
Thank you, and I actually really did appreciate that, Supervisor. I think there are two reasons I'm curious about the past and the current and how we move forward. One is recognizing that using an ordinance, we're essentially taking a different path than we have in the past to address housing in our community. And so I just want to say that that essentially we are, we're venturing into a different way of thinking about housing impacts in our community. And I think the emergency that's existing across the state of California requires us to do that. So, but thinking a little bit more about that, it also occurs to me that we may be looking at the issue of affordable housing with a new set of eyes also from a policy perspective. And I just wanted to weigh in on what I think the implications of that are. One is, I do think being able to define very concretely where the delineation is, and I just will say, I think the point that you raised earlier about who's on third relative to what are we labeling each issue. I think in this instance, because of our partnership with Stanford, making sure that we do not make that which should be simple and obvious overly complicated. And so, to be frank with you, when I was reading your report, I had a similar reaction that you did, Joe, when you were asking the clarifying questions. I found that it felt a little bit jumbled, and that's why I appreciate the ability to untangle it, and maybe because it's new to us as well. So anyway, thank you. That's very helpful. What I want to make sure I understand is what are the implications to an agreement essentially between the county and Stanford relative to affordable housing or any other agreements that were made within that GUP that may also need to be fulfilled, irrespective of where that bar gets dropped on what's going to happen under the new ordinance versus what happens under the GUP. And what I don't really know, and you may because you pay so much more attention to it, is are we caught up relative to investments of, for example, of affordable housing, commitments that were made under the GUP? Are those commitments all met to date, or are there commitments that you're still working through completing?
I can't speak to the commitments that might be made for the use of the money that's in the current Stanford Affordable Housing Trust Fund.
And let me ask you to stop just there for a minute. Was that your question, Supervisor, about the use of the funds that are currently in?
It wasn't just the funds. I was more curious about whether or not, for example, some may be funds, some may be the construction of affordable housing that they were already going to be doing. There may be other outstanding, I was really wondering how buttoned up with the definitions that you gave us are we with our current relationship with Stanford?
Would you mind if I tried and then looked to Mr. Gerard to verify the correctness of my recollection?
Sure.
So we have funds that have been received pursuant to the existing GUP. Those funds have been used and or committed for projects in the past. My successor and my predecessor, Liz Nez, led efforts to use some of those funds to preserve, in most cases, or rehabilitate affordable housing. Then, of course, there was the Buena Vista rescue effort that took a big chunk of those funds. And in fact, my recollection is that effort required more in the way of funds than were actually in the account on the day we made the commitment. So essentially, we were counting on some funds that were going to be forthcoming very quickly. It wasn't a huge amount in the context of it all. Then, in addition, we have the set aside of future funds, which obviously are not funds that have yet arrived, for the possible use in a teacher housing project in Palo Alto that we've discussed as a full board. And by whatever dollar amount we look at, whether the remaining development authorized by the GUP that has not yet paid its fees is substantially greater, actually, than what we're talking about in connection with teacher housing. So there will be, quote, plenty of money under the existing fee payment, which is done pursuant to a condition of approval in the 2000 GUP. So in terms of the funds, Mr. Gerard, that's my understanding of where we are, and I see you nodding.
Yes, that's correct.
That's different than from the commitment that is in place, the obligation actually is the proper word, the obligation that is in place pursuant to the same GUP in 2000 and the conditions of approval require a certain number of housing units to be built more or less simultaneously with a certain amount of development on the campus. And again, my recollection, Mr. Gerard, is that the way the condition was structured is that the condition says you can build 500,000 square feet of facilities or academic space, colloquially used, but you can't do more than that until you build this much housing. And then you can get up to 1 million square feet, but you can't go beyond that till you get to this much, and so on and so forth. So I don't know where we are in terms of the, I know we're over 1 million and less than 2 million, where we are in that counting and matching process. I don't know. Perhaps planning staff can tell us if they have a number today. But that obligation continues going forward with further academic development through the life of the GUP as things now stand because it was a condition of approval. Let me just ask Mr. Gerard if my understanding of the process is at least correct, even though I can't come up with a number.
That is the process. There is a requirement that they provide housing in proportion to the academic space they construct, and an additional requirement that they either build an affordable unit to meet those requirements or pay an impact fee, and that as a condition of the current GUP.
But just to follow back up on what Joe was just saying, is that are there outstanding units to be built? I'm not as worried about the money. I know we can collect on that. You're good for finishing that up. I'm just wondering, are we caught up on the housing as it stands today?
My recollection is that for each 500,000 square feet, there was 500 units, more or less. Is it 5? Please come up, Ms. Palter.
Yes, thank you.
And help us with our memory here. And that actually is separate housing construction obligation for faculty and staff and grad students and postdocs that is different from the affordable housing fee, which is for a different kind of housing, which is not covered by what I'm calling the stair-step obligation. Ms. Palter?
Correct. The stair-step or housing linkage is 500,000 square feet, 605 housing units or student beds. And we're in your third tier. The total requirement at the end of the 2000 GUP is to build 2,420 beds or units. We are a handful shy of that today, and when the Escondido Village Graduate Residences opens in 2 years, we'll be at 4,400 beds, well beyond the requirement.
So that will be completed. I mean, that agreement will essentially,
We've essentially met it today. EV is just icing on the cake. That was not required.
And excuse me, Ms. Palter, just to be clear, Supervisor Chavez, the Escondido Village project came along, I'm going to say, outside the framework of the GUP. In other words, it was not a part of what was expected by or through the GUP. It was neither authorized nor required by the GUP. It was a separate application that came along, and you and I never saw it at the board level because it got resolved at the Planning Commission level, if I remember correctly. No? Or did it not even go to the Planning Commission now that I think about it?
The floor was established in the GUP, the minimum number of houses that needed to be constructed, and there was a mechanism in the GUP to approve any units beyond the floor, and that was a Planning Commission review.
Got it.
Thank you.
And then the further piece of it is, Supervisor, so we also have, and this is my colloquial characterization of the conversation 20 years ago, so Stanford's articulated view at the time was, gee, we do a great job providing housing for our faculty and our students, and the question then arose, yes, but what about your lower wage workers? And what about housing for them? And the back and forth ultimately resulted in folks at Stanford saying, we're not sure we want to build that housing on our campus, so if we don't do that, we'd like to be able to pay a fee in lieu. And I'm not saying Stanford was volunteering or jumping up and down with enthusiasm about paying a fee. I'm just saying they wanted the flexibility to pay the fee for development within a 6-mile radius, and that was where that came from. And as you will recall, that then happens again as we go with more and more facilities, that obligation to pay that fee for affordable housing kicks in pursuant to a condition of approval in the current GUP. And where we are currently struggling is that the staff has said $35 is the fee. Stanford is making the case that they believe it is $20, and the way that that issue has been put off for now is that the university has taken the opportunity to use their credits, which they get when they demolish a building, so that they don't have to pay the fee. So in other words, if they demolish 100,000 square feet worth of building, then when they replace that 100,000 feet, as I understand it, it does not count towards the calculation of 2 million square feet, and therefore it does not oblige the university to pay a fee. And then, so meanwhile, we're in stalemate, and probably more than that, I shouldn't say, under the watchful eye of the county council. See, that was a watchful eye.
That was.
So we've got the housing that was required under the GUP from 2000. We've got the housing that was requested and approved sort of on top of that housing. We've got the housing fee pursuant to the GUP, and we've got housing fee funds that we can count on coming for the remainder of the GUP once you figure out how many square feet there are that have yet to be collected. Did I got it right, Mr. Gerard?
Those are all the categories, yes.
Thank you.
Great. And I just have a couple more questions. One relative to information, and then the other just relative to one of the requests that Stanford has just made. Some years ago, I saw a document, and I actually think this may have been something that Stanford produced, that showed where Stanford employees currently live. And I would be very interested in getting an updated analysis that demonstrates that. And I think that Stanford was using this as a demonstration, which I think is very significant and important to the I think it might have been just looking at economic impact, economic strength, and what role that Stanford's playing in our community. And I think very many good ones, so to be clear. But one of the reasons I was interested in having this information is I do think it's important to recognize that as the market gets tighter and tighter for housing, and land costs are just, phenomenal. In some cities, they're higher than others. For example, if you're buying a piece of property in Cupertino, especially if well, they don't have much of it, but if you have contiguous properties more than a single acre, you're paying 5, 6, and I've seen at least one that is $7 million an acre. I think that as you go further south, we're still, while the market again is terribly tight, it's much lower cost in San Jose than it is to live in Palo Alto. So I'm interested in understanding where people are living, because I'm also interested in, and this is a discussion that we need to have about what the radius is that it's appropriate to spend revenue that comes out of this, which I hope is very little, because I hope you're building the housing on your campus. But if it's not built there, then how do we, what's the most appropriate way to determine whether or not it's 6 miles or countywide? The reason I chose the 68 number was because that was a countywide number, but I recognize that I wanted this committee discussion, I wanted Hewlett. I think it's really worth having a bigger conversation. So anyway, that's one reason. The second reason I wanted us to, the other piece of information I think is really important to take a look at is where we think there is land that is still developable by county standards, and especially where we are, where we have this green line, where do we have open space? Because the one thing that I am really committed to as it relates to Measure A, and I think it's important that our housing policies align as much as possible, is that a big part of Measure A's investment really needs to be on construction of new places for people to live. I think it's important to do rehab. I think it's important to buy places and make them affordable. But the fact of the matter is, if we don't build more housing, we have a problem. So where we have land available. And then second, I think it is really critical that we take a look at those areas that we consider to be transit hubs relative to opportunities for investment. And I'll just use one example, although there may be others that Supervisor, that you are familiar with that are more in North County. One is that I know that VTA has approximately 25 sites. I believe it's that many sites that are going to be put up for request for qualifications and request for bids for land to be leased proximate to light rail, even some bus stations, and potentially the new BART coming online. And I know that we, the county, in the past, I don't think we have this anymore, but there were many pieces of property, even VTA still has some, that are close to expressways, that are going to be, the VTA is going to be looking for long-term investment in housing and frankly also in jobs, because I think what we're understanding is that we've got to start putting jobs near transit as well. But nonetheless, while all of that, I think that's actually really important, because I think those are some very clear opportunities that we have to leverage resources that are relatively significant. I think that becomes more important as we understand that the tax credits have almost, relative to the value they used to have, they have almost none now. And we know that because as part of our Measure A fund, we have lots of people coming that were relying on tax credits that can't now to fund projects. So in any case, I think but as we talk about what the appropriate level or the appropriate assigned costs are and the appropriate locations of that, I think those pieces of information would be important for the board to understand. I think, oh, and there's one last question I have. Thank you, Supervisor. You know, as Stanford has come forward and they asked a little bit about opportunities for engagement, I'm curious about now whether or not you have been meeting with Stanford in particular to get feedback on this, or is this happening in public meetings, or is it happening in 26 pages of letters that are going on now? And also, Supervisor, you may have been doing convenings as well, but I'm curious if Stanford's asking to engage in the process, and the public, by the way, not just Stanford, but we have housing advocates and others that are interested in this, is the way we're asking people to engage through these public meetings, and or are we asking people to give us their thoughts in writing, and or what other engagements are we going to have, both with Stanford but other folks that are interested, if any?
Through all those means, it's helpful to receive input in writing. We do have these public forums where everyone can hear and participate in the same conversation. We have regularly scheduled meetings with Stanford in which we can continue a conversation related to this, as well as other aspects of, well, in addition to the permit application that's before us. And we haven't received, to my knowledge, any other stakeholder input to date, but we do have a meeting at Hewlett next week, and we will have, if we follow the schedule we've set forth, an opportunity in July with the Planning Commission as well.
Thank you. That's all my questions right now.
Okay. Let me offer a couple of comments, and I obviously can't speak for my colleague, but I think you know, having had 2 full board meetings, I'm not sure that I can provide much more in the way of clarity or direction, but there are a few areas where I can at least articulate what my thinking is or what my preferences are, so that as the staff is trying to cobble together some notion of what board consensus might look like, you have the ability to do that. I want to say something I've said previously, but it's a recurring theme, so I think it bears repeating. It is clearly my preference that that the housing get built rather than a fee get paid. Just you know, that's just and that doesn't mean we give away the store with incentives to build the housing, but and in fact, part of the challenge that I think that goal has is that if the fee is too low, then someone is in a position of saying, well, we'd rather pay the fee than build the housing. So I don't know how you square that circle. But again, my goal is to see housing get built, need get addressed, rather than simply collect a fee. Do I think the fee will ultimately be put to a good use that will address the problem? Yes, but I think to Supervisor Chavez's earlier comment, the more direct we can be about need and addressing need, that's the ideal. There was a comment / question from one of the speakers from the university about the fact that the fee amount, $68.50, was drawn from the study, and that that fee amount, according to the study, was sufficient to address the need for extremely low, very low, and low income, but not moderate income. I think as a statement of what the study said, I had much the same reaction. That being said, I did not hear the board say we don't want to serve moderate income households. So I am in the same place the staff recommendation is, which is notwithstanding the fact that that amount happened to come from, okay, here's how much we could do with that. I do think you are headed in the right direction to make sure we include folks in all 4 of those income categories, because we will have folks who, given wages at the university, are going to very much be in that 80 to 120% category, and I don't want them to sort of end up not in the mix just because the number happened to be drawn from there. So I think that's where I am. In terms of the 6-mile radius, and I read the study cover to cover, which was a joy when we had the meeting before. Haven't done it more recently. I think what the study purported to do was say, if you bring a bunch of people to this location, then you create a bunch of housing demand in this location, and therefore we should figure out what it's going to cost to provide housing in this location. And I think that is logical, and I think that's the path that I would like to see us head. Having said that, the university has argued, they might have a different take. The university has argued, well, but wait, our folks actually live in other places that are more remote, so you should look at housing costs there. And my response to that is, no, that's the problem. That's not the solution. The fact that people are living in Oakland or in Gilroy, wonderful communities that they are, is not because they want to live in Oakland and Gilroy and drive vast distances in a crushing commute to get to work. It's because they don't have housing options within a 6-mile radius. And when we say, well, let's look at putting folks in Oakland and Gilroy and other parts, obviously, essentially what we've said is, why don't we perpetuate the transportation problem that we already have by telling people, oh no, you're not going to be 5 minutes away from work and minimize, your carbon footprint and your hours in the car. We're going to deliberately think about putting you in more remote distances. That being said, and this part, there's not a tactful way to say it, so I'm just going to say it in a tactless way. I don't want my board colleagues to think that I'm being piggy about having all of the money from this fund end up in the 5th Supervisorial District or across the county line in South San Mateo County, where I think there's a good case to be made that we should be spending some of this money as well, because that is in close proximity to the university and would help us with these transportation problems. So I'm open certainly to some portion of the funds being used beyond that magic line. That being said, I don't want to see them used beyond that magic line in a way that perpetuates what is already a horrific transportation crisis in Santa Clara County. I don't think we're doing anybody any favors by saying, congratulations, we're going to help you live 45 miles away and an hour-and-a-half commute. On the study and the methodology of the study, I think I'm going to look at the letter, as Supervisor Chavez indicated. The letter arrived 6:30 last night, so I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but we'll look at it. We'll appreciate hearing staff's view again after having taken a look at it. I will say, as I think I did at a previous meeting, you know, our maximum justifiable fee came in at $143.10 a square foot. My recollection is that the city of Palo Alto, which is immediately adjacent, came in at $260 plus. That tells me that if anything, our study was small c conservative in its estimation of the cost. And why don't I stop there for a moment, Supervisor Chavez, and let you make some comments, and I may have some other thoughts as well after hearing you.
Thank you. So as it relates to the affordability types and the mitigation fee, you know, I think it's going to be ironically important that the higher fee in a odd way is actually an incentive. And I say that only because I was listening to you. I thought, well, one incentive is you don't want to do X. So now that being said, part of the reason I was looking at the lower fee in the initial report was that I was also trying to think about how to how to really frankly pay for the impacts that Stanford has without being too negative in terms of how we were impacting Stanford. So that's actually why I chose that number. I am really interested in what I heard what Supervisor Simitian said. I'm really interested in what comes out of Hewlett too. So I'm going to reserve my thinking on that topic. I want to emphasize, and really to emphasize this to you all that are here, it would be so much better if you could build what you can on your campus. That's really ultimately what I think the whole board wants. And I have had, since I've been here now almost 5 years, at least 3 years of discussions with Stanford about staff housing in particular. And I haven't been unclear, I haven't hidden the ball, I've just been asking about that, where that is in the process. And I frankly think that in some respects, this creates probably a really good opportunity to get staff housing built on campus, and something I'm going to want to understand better from you as we go through this process. I want to just say a couple things about this location. When I think about this location, I think Supervisor Simitian, you're right, that in some ways the boundary between Santa Clara County and San Mateo County, particularly as it relates to Stanford, can be a very soft line. I also think as we think about affordability and quality of life that we really are, as often as we can, thinking about these 9 Bay Area counties in as much a single way that we can, especially as it relates to investments like BART and Caltrain and others that really require jurisdictions to work together. Having said that, if I think about somebody taking a train from Gilroy to Stanford versus driving from Los Altos or other places that don't have direct transportation, I think that part of what we need to consider is where there are opportunities to save trips on that campus in peak times with public transportation. And we have the line of public transportation is up the spine of San Mateo County and really the side of Santa Clara County, and what I hope very soon as it relates to BART coming into, well, at least into Berryessa. And I think that what we're going to see is that we're going to have more and more people moving into, I hope, places like, frankly, San Jose, that, the mayor just announced he's going to build 25,000 more units, and we don't have anything, I don't know how he's going to do it, he just announced it, so I'm still waiting for the how-to plan, but nonetheless, I mean, that is a city, I think, them, Milpitas, Sunnyvale, Mountain View. Mountain View's done a phenomenal job of building housing. And I think that being able to really take any new resources along with the resources we have from Measure A and other resources that come in, that as much flexibility as we have to leverage resources as a county is really what I want to make sure that we have the capacity to do. And that's partly why I am really thinking about it countywide, and period. And I also really appreciate that you, in particular, are really burdened with thinking about how this impacts our San Mateo partners. And, and I know that we've had at least one inquiry from San Mateo about the Measure A money. Interestingly, they didn't talk to me about the Stanford money, which is where I sent them back to you. But to look at.
And they have talked to me about the
Okay.
Stanford money, just so you
But
know.
nonetheless, I mean, if we're thinking about this as one pot, I do think it gives us even more flexibility to think regionally than maybe we're able to do today, because I think it burdens you with one very finite pot versus us thinking much more collaboratively. So, so again, I'll be interested in seeing where we really are seeing people live. And then the only last thing I'd like to say is I know that Stanford feels like that for some reason that the door has been closed to them in terms of giving feedback and the like. And I really appreciate, Mr. Gerard, you're saying, no, we're open to having conversations. I think it's really important that we have conversations with Stanford. That in my mind, getting their input, I think that's very important. I do think this is a very different process than we've had with Stanford in the past, and I think that's what's making people feel so uncomfortable. But I think it is the right. So this is my message to the staff, and this is something I would say to Stanford. I think there's been such a high level of focus on this being an ordinance versus some other product or mechanism for resolving a problem, that there's a lot of emphasis on the mechanism and not so much emphasis on what's the problem we're trying to solve. So I would just say to you that as you're listening to Stanford, and I would say this to Stanford too, that the problem we're trying to solve is mitigating the impacts, the concrete impacts that Stanford expansion has on affordable housing, period. How do we address that, period? And the staff, we've chosen a mechanism for addressing that right now, but what I'd like to make sure happens is that there's a discussion that happens between our two teams that is not mechanism oriented, because I think that we're going to get nowhere. And I have been frankly very frustrated in my conversations because I think there's such an emphasis on the mechanism that I think the point that Supervisor Simitian just raised a minute ago, and I want to just reemphasize that we're really just trying to get the housing built. We're not really trying to collect the fees, because it would be much better for the housing to be built, especially for your staff. And I don't mean just faculty, staff, and students. I mean the lower income folks you have working for you. I just want to make sure they're not left out, that's really what I'm interested in seeing. So thank you, and thank you for indulging me.
No, absolutely, thank you. And just a couple more observations. And, clearly our board will have to figure out this issue of location and use of funds and all of that. And yes, I want to be open to and encouraging of the use of transit. That being said, and now I'm going to draw my number from the new GUP process rather than from the Nexus study, my recollection is that it says 9,600 new faculty, staff, students, and workers over the life of the next 15 years or so. At the risk of stating the obvious, if you put 9,600 people at the Stanford campus who aren't there today, it's going to have more of an impact on Menlo Park, Palo Alto, and Mountain View than it is Gilroy and Morgan Hill. So I'm saying, as we think regionally, which I want to do, because I'm even looking to the north to think regionally, I think we also need to understand that the place where the impact's going to be felt most immediately, most directly, and most significantly is going to be in closer proximity, because those folks are going to be looking for housing if they can possibly find it close by. So I'm just going to leave that one out there, and we'll have some lively conversations about that as a board, I feel sure. Going back to the comment that Supervisor Chavez made a minute ago about the mechanism, and now I want to look to Mr. Williams, our county counsel, because I'm going to make an assertion that I want to make sure he's buying into. I think it's important to acknowledge as well today that whatever we end up doing with respect to an ordinance that to some extent mitigates the housing impact that we've been discussing, that this is not an exclusive remedy, that it's not the only tool. That's why there is a conversation at ULIT about an inclusionary housing ordinance, and that's why there will be a conversation about conditions of approval once we get to that point in the GUP process. Mr. Williams, is
Yes.
that an accurate recitation?
Yes, this is one legislative tool that the board has available, just like the inclusionary housing ordinance is another legislative tool, and then there's other ways of approaching the same broader set of issues.
And nothing that we would do here would preclude us from using any of these other tools simply by the adoption of an ordinance, is my point. Okay, good. Thank you. That, I think, is an important point to lay down. I understand why that creates some anxiety on the part of the university about, well, wait a minute, how can we get a comprehensive look-see and conversation about all these things? But it's the nature of the process. Then just a question for County Counsel's office, if you can, and forgive me, I've sort of lost track of where we are on inclusionary zoning law in California. Can local jurisdictions, including our county, impose a inclusionary zoning requirement on rental housing only, housing for purchase only, neither, both? Where do we stand? I know there was a lot of legal kerfuffle around this and a debate about whether or not it constituted rent control, and the legislature was going to weigh in but didn't, or where are we?
Inclusionary zoning ordinances may be applied both to rental housing and for sale housing.
And
So
that's
both.
the current state of the law, yes?
Correct.
Great, thank you, good to know. Good. Does staff have any questions of the two members of the committee? Or have we worn you out today?
Not at this time.
Then the only other thing I will say is to indicate what I'm not saying. And what I'm not saying is where that puts me on a dollar amount. I had made a motion at a full board meeting for the $68.50 amount based on a comment from my colleague Supervisor Chavez that was an amount she could support. That then headed off in a somewhat different direction at the request of Supervisor Cortese, who wanted that to be a floor, not a ceiling. You've come to us with, okay, how about we start with $68.50, and how about we end up at $143.10? And if it feels like I haven't given you a reaction to that, it's because I haven't. Okay, so I just want to be clear about that. The other thing I haven't come to haven't offered an opinion on today is when such a fee might take place. Excuse me. When such a fee might take effect. To go back to the question about operative dates and effective dates. I think, as I said earlier, there's a difference between what is legally permissible and what might be desirable from a policy standpoint, and I want to think that one through a little bit more. I know that our colleague Supervisor Wasserman talked about the importance of having a ramp-up period. That, I think that may be my phrase, not his. And I know that that ramp-up period will be, very different depending on who you are. I'm guessing that the folks from the university, and it's dangerous for me to guess, but that their idea of, going from where we are today to $68.50 to $143.10 over a period of a year might not be their idea of a gradual ramp-up. That's just my take. On the other hand, it's a graduated increase. Fair enough. I take your point on that. So I have yet to reach a conclusion about what that is, let alone offer an opinion today about what that graduated ramp-up might look like over what period of time and when it should kick in. And again, I sort of wanted to be clear about what I wasn't saying today so people didn't attribute a point of view that wasn't articulated. Last call, Supervisor Chavez. Supervisor Chavez is like sitting here thinking, I have to listen to not only what he wants, but I have to listen to what he didn't say now. That's a match. So
That's not true.
Okay,
On the one hand,
on the other hand. Exactly right. So, all right. Last call of staff. Okay, and this is a little unusual, Supervisor Chavez, but in the spirit of making sure everybody gets heard today, any objection to me going back to Stanford?
No, I think that would be great. I was actually
you
going to
folks
recommend that.
want to come up and just offer one or two last comments? You don't have to, but if there are issues you want to lay on the table, having heard us all speak, feel free. Okay, you've had sufficient. All right. Then we do need to take some action today on this item, and I believe that what we're going to do, I'm looking for my language from staff, is simply receive the report and from the Department of Planning and Development relating to a draft affordable housing impact mitigation fee ordinance and provide input and direction, regarding policies and concepts contained therein. So Supervisor Chavez, you prepared to make a motion to receive the report?
So moved. With the requests for information that were put out.
And a second, and I look forward to hearing what you learn at the Hewlett meeting. And without objection, that item is concluded. Thank you all very much to both staff and those who are in attendance today. All right. All right. Supervisor Chavez, we have dealt with items 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 was on consent, 8 was on consent, 9 was deferred, 10 was deferred, 11 was on consent, 12 was on consent, and that leaves us with items 13, 14, and 15, and possibly 16 if we need to recess to close session. But our next item is to receive the report from the Office of the Registrar of Voters relating to the management audit of the Registrar of Voters. And if you could identify yourselves and give us your name and title for the record, and we'll take it from there.
Shannon Boucher, Registrar of Voters.
And with you is?
Matt Morellis, Assistant Registrar of Voters.
Thanks very much. And this, of course, is to receive the report relating to the management audit of the Registrar of Voters. And so I'm going to turn to our management audit representative here today. Any comments before we begin? Or should we turn first to the staff? All right. Do you have any comments you want to make, or are we really just confronting the fact that while a number of these implementation is either underway or in place, that we do have a few places where there are outstanding differences of opinion? Yes?
I'm prepared to do either. We can provide you a summary on the items still in progress or that we're not implementing, which is a total of 5 out of 18. 13 of 18 have fully been implemented.
I think, Supervisor Chavez, the most expeditious way would be to hear what are the areas of disagreement, and can we get to yes on some of them either today or in the future. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and I actually have a hard stop at 5.
All right. So, an alternative approach, given a hard stop at 5, is that we could defer this item on the audit and go instead to the issue of voting security and or have a closed session. Yeah. All right, I'm getting the inclination that what we're going to do is we're going to defer, quote unquote, item 13 to the meeting in August, to our FGOC meeting then, and instead we will go to item 14 and 16 if we need, bless you, if we need to recess on these issues of voter security. So, can we ask somebody to come down and give us that report instead? Thank you for your flexibility.
Hi, Justin Dietrich, Chief Information Security Officer. We have been tasked to review and perform risk assessment on the county's Register of Voters. We've completed that risk assessment and are able to provide reports to the committee in closed session.
All right. Is there anything that you think you can and appropriately should share in open session beyond telling us that we have information that we need to hear in closed session? That's just for the record.
Not at this time.
All right. Ms. Boucher, anything you want to say in connection with this that's appropriate for our open session?
Not at this time.
All right. Then Supervisor Chavez, I think what I would like to do is say, can we get a motion saying we have received that brief report? That's item 14.
So moved.
Motion by Chavez, second by Simidian, and without objection, deemed approved. And then I will announce now under item 15 that we are going to recess to closed session for item number 16, and we will consider only those items that are listed under item 16. We will, at the conclusion of that closed session meeting, reconvene briefly here in the chambers to announce any reportable actions if there are reportable actions to report. So without objection, we are in recess. Thank you. For the record, we are reconvening the Finance and Government Operations Committee meeting of June the 14th, and we have been in closed session pursuant to item 16. This is now item 17, Supervisor Chavez, where we have reconvened an open session for a closed session report, where we will announce any reportable action taken in closed session. I'm looking to the County Council, who's going to tell us.
There were no reportable actions taken at the June 14, 2018 Finance and Government Operations Committee closed session meeting.
Thank you very much. That being the case, since items 18 and 19 were approved in our consent calendar, that takes us to item 20, which is to indicate that we are now adjourned to our next regular meeting of this committee, unless a special meeting is called. Thank you all very much. We are adjourned.